2020 was set for me to have one of my biggest years ever prior to the start of the pandemic. I had planned trips to parks all around the eastern US, even uploading a 7-minute video detailing my plans to ride every Giga Coaster in chronological order in the US in 1 year. This would have included my first ever visit to King's Dominion and riding the newest Giga Coaster, Orion, on its opening day. It also included many visits to other parks such as Silver Dollar City, Busch Gardens Williamsburg, the IX Indoor Amusement Park, Worlds of Fun, Dollywood, Carowinds, and more. My video detailing these plans was uploaded on March 2nd, 2020. Only a few days later, all the plans would be cancelled as the pandemic restrictions set in. In late March and April, I was unsure if I would even be able to work at Cedar Point that year, let alone visit all the parks I had planned to. But by the end of the year, I had visited more parks than I could have ever imagined. Here's how 2020 went from my best year for coasters to my worst, and then back to the best. 2020 was set to be a big year for me. I was still getting into the world of coasters and was preparing to work for my second season at Cedar Point. I had been on around 100 different roller coasters at the time, but compared to many people I talked to in the community, this was still pretty low. There were so many parks I wanted to visit, and they were all finally starting to get within my reach, as not only could I finally drive long distances, but I would have the money, the friends, and the free time to go to these parks for the first time ever. Accordingly, I had a huge year planned for visiting new parks. This would see me reach over 200 coasters as well as visit many bucket list parks. It was such a big year that I even uploaded, that mentioned, full video about my plans for trips that year, and my channel at the time was really just starting to take off. It was truly an exciting time. However, these plans would all be cancelled just a few weeks later as the restrictions due to the pandemic set in. I set the video to unlisted and assumed I would not get to ride any new coasters or visit any new parks that year. As the months wore on and April turned into May, parks began to look seriously at opening again. In late May, I was given the option to return to Cedar Point for work in mid-June. I took this and was grateful that I would at least get to spend some time at a park that year. Later, I found out that the Kings Island Orion First Rider event was rescheduled for July 1st, which I gladly adjusted my plans to be able to attend. It seemed that I would be riding at least one new coaster that year. Attending the First Rider event seemed like some kind of dream. It was so late in the year to be riding a new coaster, but it felt so good to be back in a park and around people again. That event was one of the best I've attended, and I had an absolute blast riding the new coaster several times with almost no wait, getting some of the only night rides offered that year due to the park's limited hours. It was also my first time being one of the first few thousand riders on a coaster, something I've done several times since, probably being in the first 100 at this point, but at that time it was completely new to me, which was just incredible. This event set the tone for the rest of the year. Though it would not be a normal year, I would still make the most of what was available. Due to the pandemic, Cedar Point would significantly scale back their hours. I would take full advantage of this time off to take trips to parks that were open. In late summer, I took a trip to Hershey Park with some friends who had never been. After getting out to Hershey, we realized that not only was Great Adventure open, but so was Knoebels and Dorney Park. I had visited all these parks the first time the year prior, so they were not new to me, but it was great getting back to several rides that I wanted to ride more. This impromptu trip inspired many others, including my first ever trip to Indiana Beach, Waldameer, and more. Near the end of the year, I was able to take one of my worst coaster trips of my life, a non-stop drive to American Dream Mall to visit the recently opened Nickelodeon universe. This was followed by a stop at Great Adventure, and well, both parks really were pretty bad. This was combined with a hurricane bearing down on the area, which closed Great Adventure, which we planned to visit again the next day, which essentially rained out the rest of our trip, resulting in a long drive back to Ohio with no other parks being visited. These lows would be followed by some great highs though, as I took a cheap flight to Orlando for my first ever visit to the Universal Orlando parks, which honestly I really did not enjoy very much, but that was okay, as it also included a revisit to SeaWorld Orlando, both fun spots, and my first ever visit to a Disney park with Hollywood Studios, which I absolutely loved. Tower of Terror is the best ride ever made. And my first ever visit as well to Busch Gardens Tampa, which I loved. Being able to ride Kumba for the first time was a surreal experience, as that was a coaster I had always dreamed of getting to ride. This was followed by another trip to Indiana Beach for their first and only year running a haunt event. After the Cedar Point season ended though, the trips only ramped up. I was able to do an all-driving trip to Six Flags St. Louis and Silver Dollar City for my first and only visits. Unfortunately, Worlds of Fun was not open for this trip, but that was okay. Both the parks I did get to visit beat expectations and were absolute blasts to visit. I was also able to ride one of the best flat rides I had been on to date, Excalibur, which is something I'm very glad I got to do, as it has since been removed and I've not had the chance to visit that park again. After one day at Six Flags and several enjoying everything Silver Dollar City had to offer, including the fantastic Time Traveler, that trip was over. Though I do need to revisit Silver Dollar City as the cave tour was not open during the pandemic. Regardless, the trip was all about making the most out of the cards that we were dealt that year. The year concluded with what I think is probably still one of my best trips of all time, which was being invited on a trip out to Texas with several great friends. The trip would involve flying from Ohio to Dallas, staying with a friend, and visiting Six Flags Over Texas for a few days. This would be my first time at that park. Then driving to CDT's, Six Flags Fiesta Texas, and SeaWorld San Antonio. All of these parks were incredible, except SeaWorld, but it was on this trip that I would officially pass over 200 coasters ridden. I had been to Fiesta Texas before, but my experience in 2018 on my first visit was not near as good as my visit in 2020, when the park really seemed to be firing on all cylinders, which was surprising considering this was still during the pandemic. This trip concluded with a trip to Orlando, as the flight from Dallas to Orlando to Columbus was cheaper than flying directly from Dallas to Columbus. This meant I ended the year with some final park visits at SeaWorld Orlando and Fun Spot. This concluded what I think is my best coaster year of all time. In the years since, the way that I experience parks has changed significantly, and I can honestly say that I would never want to do what I did in 2020 again. But it was a great experience at the time. I've since stopped counting coasters, but I'm confident that I've not had a year with as many new parks or coasters as 2020. Though I did not visit many of the parks I originally wanted to, I would end up visiting all of those parks in the subsequent years. Meanwhile, many of the parks that I did get to visit that year have remained out of reach since. 2020 proved that any situation is what you make it, and I'm very content with how the year ended up playing out. What have been your best coaster years? How did you cope with 2020 if you were a coaster enthusiast at the time? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.